Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's July 24th, 2026, and we have a fun one today. We are going to be applying the socio-sexual hierarchy, or SSH for short, developed by Vox Day. We're going to apply it to Final Fantasy games, or at least that's where we will ultimately end up. We'll start with something a little bit more accessible by talking about the socio-sexual hierarchy. It was developed by Vox Day, as previously noted, as an alternative to the simple alpha-beta framework that had developed among the pickup artist community in the late aughts and early teens. Vox Day stuck with the Greek lettering theme, but expanded it far beyond just alpha and beta, where alpha had become shorthand for some behavior or approach or look that women found attractive, and beta referred to something the opposite, something that was unattractive to women. And not just women, but also to other men in non-sexual ways. So an alpha move would be something that would exert dominance, while a beta move would indicate submission. Alphas, as the name implies, sit at the top of the dominance hierarchy. They naturally command attention and respect, they're highly attractive to women, and they lead social groups without effort. They're confident without needing any validation. And before we get too far into this, I should point out that the SSH is developed to be descriptive, not prescriptive. So unlike the dichotomous alpha-beta terminology that preceded the SSH, the intention of the SSH is not to judge particular actions or particular approaches, but instead to characterize individuals, to slot them into one of these different categories in the SSH. And in that way, it's closer to something like a personality test in terms of what it tells those who are utilizing it about the subjects they are assessing. And yes, it should be said at the outset, too, that this is the realm of pop psychology that we're entering here. It's descriptive and typological, not scientifically rigorous in an empirical sense. Okay, yes, duly noted, but so what? Compared to the professional field of psychology, which has nothing but decades of BS, unreplicable studies from which conclusions are drawn that align with whatever the politically correct mandated position at the time is deemed to be. The majority of studies in the psychological literature, when attempted to be replicated, come to either statistically insignificant results or results that are actually statistically significantly different than the original results that were reported. You've probably heard at some point about power poses, the idea that how a person physically stands in place, the pose that they strike has an effect on how effective they are able to be as leaders or how persuasive they're able to be. You do a little digging, and the one study from which this comes from decades ago involved like 6 people, and the results are based on a subjective survey that was given asking people how they felt, or asking other people when they viewed the person what they thought of them. Something very superficial and trivial like that. And it claimed some big effect, and then when it's been attempted to be replicated over and over again with larger numbers and serious metrics, no measurable effect manifests. You've probably heard about implicit bias, for which there is no empirical grounding. There are seminars, there are HR struggle sessions that people all over the Western world have been subjected to, countless hours of misery all over this BS idea that there is some empirical validation for the idea of implicit bias. There isn't. It's a handful of tests that haven't been able to be replicated. And as the field of psychology has grown, so have the volume and severity of mental health issues. Almost as if, rather than making things better, the existing field is actually accentuating existing problems and making them worse. And the one thing that psychology has actually gotten right over the last century is the one thing that the great and good in the field run hysterically away from. That is IQ, the intelligent quotient, the one thing that is rock solid in its empirical validation and its predictive power, whole host of life outcomes. And so, yes, this is pop psychology. It is a framework Vox Day puts together that has become over time something of an open source project, to some chagrin by Vox Day, who has written recently a book on the subject of the sociosexual hierarchy. But Vox Day has a knack for identifying things in a way that, despite being outside of the Overton window, still manages to penetrate popular culture. If you've heard your son or some younger kid you know refer to someone as Sigma, that not only does that come from Vox Day, but that comes directly from the socio-sexual hierarchy that we're about to discuss. Yo, that's Sigma, bro. If you have teenage or tweenage sons, you've heard that from them or their friends. Another term that Vox Day coined was midwit, a term that describes the type of person who knows what the mainstream conventional positions on things are and knows a couple of sentences to describe why the positions are what they are, but that is as far as their knowledge goes. Before applying the SSH to video games in the Final Fantasy series, we'll take a look at some of the examples of the archetypes from movies and TV shows, bounded by my spotty, to put it mildly, exposure to pop culture. But fortunately, these archetypes have garnered the attention they have. That is, the SSH has received the attention it has, is because they resonate, because they are quite descriptive and not difficult to slot into just about any narrative story. And also, in your own life, in the people that you know. Should also state, if it wasn't insinuated previously, the sociosexual hierarchy applies to men, to heterosexual men. There is an exception for what Vox Day terms as lambdas, which are those who are not heterosexual, homosexual men who, by their very definition, exist outside of the sociosexual hierarchy, because the sexual part of that doesn't apply to homosexual men in anything like the same way that it does for heterosexual men. And so we will not be discussing that aspect of the SSH here. And so for the alpha example, we have Maximus from the movie Gladiator, the character played by Russell Crowe. He commands loyalty effortlessly across every context he's portrayed in, whether it be Roman general, slave, gladiator. That is the definitive alpha marker. True alpha authority transcends any sort of institutional position. Maximus demonstrates this repeatedly when he's stripped of everything after Commodus executes the coup against Marcus Aurelius, and Maximus refuses to join in the coup, and his family is slain, and he is ordered to be executed, but escapes the execution to end up enslaved by a traveling gladiatorial caravan. The other gladiators orient toward him naturally.
General, I hope my coming here today is evidence enough that you can trust me.
The Senate is with you?
The Senate? Yes. I can speak for them.
You can buy my freedom and smuggle me out of Rome.
To what end?
Get me outside the city walls. Have fresh horses ready to take me to Ostia. My army is encamped there. By nightfall of the second day, I shall return at the head of 5,000 men.
But the legions all have new commanders, loyal to Commodus.
Let my men see me alive, and you shall see where their loyalties lie.
This is madness. No Roman army has entered the capital in 100 years. I will not trade one dictatorship for another.
The time for half measures and talk is over, Senator.
And after your glorious coup, what then? You'll take your 5,000 warriors and leave?
I will leave. The soldiers will stay for your protection under the command of the Senate.
So? Once all of Rome is yours, you'll just give it back to the people. Tell me why.
Because that was the last wish of a dying man. I will kill Commodus. The fate of Rome, I leave to you.
Marcus Aurelius trusted you. His daughter trusts you. I will trust you.
Next, we have Beta. They are the reliable provisioning men. of society, socially successful and competent, not tending to be the dominant figure in a room when an alpha is present, but well regarded, and in a way that critically distinguishes them from deltas, which we'll get to next. Betas are able to assume a stand-in role for alphas when alphas are not present. They are not as naturally and effortlessly inclined towards the natural leadership that alphas possess, but they are able to offer a functional simulation of it. And for the pop culture example of this, I turn again to Gladiator. The character Hagen, played by actor and former competitive bodybuilder Ralph Moeller. An actor who, if you were casting your own screenplay for a live action version of Final Fantasy VI around the turn of the century, in around the year 2000, the actor you would want to cast as Sabine, which might be a little bit of a spoiler alert as to how Sabine is categorized. Hagen is loyal, he's capable, he executes without any resentment, and he finds genuine fulfillment in his service role to Maximus. He's not jockeying in competition with Maximus, but he is clearly the leader of the gladiatorial contingent, at least prior to Maximus's arrival. And unfortunately, the best scene in the movie Gladiator that portrays the dynamic of Hagen as beta and Maximus as alpha, one that is almost entirely visual. There is virtually no dialogue in the scene. Hagen tests Maximus not long after Maximus is captured by the slave gladiatorial train. Maximus, having lost his family, his high station in the Roman army, and his emperor, who he served, is rendered unable to function for a brief period of time, a very brief period of time. He is the alpha, and the quintessential stoic is knocked off kilter. And it's not something that lasts very long, despite the biblical, almost Job-like level of suffering Maximus endures. He is, in short order, able to naturally become the leader of the gladiators he fights with, and he leads them to a stunning upset victory in the Colosseum. That underscores how alpha he is. But of course, alphas are human, and given all that he'd lost and the position he found himself in, that he was momentarily disoriented rather than permanently broken is something Hagen recognizes immediately. Though Hagen doesn't say anything to Maximus during that brief test, it's clear from his nonverbal communication he understands Maximus, and by the end of the film, Hagen ends up sacrificing himself for Maximus. That self-sacrifice is crucial in allowing Maximus to face down and vanquish Commodus. Next, we'll discuss the deltas. Deltas are the average, ordinary man. They're functional, not especially dominant, not especially attractive. They make up the bulk of the male population. They're largely defined by being unremarkable. They are defined by a loyalty and guidance and instructions from systems and institutions that are established and provide cues for them. When the systems and the institutions are healthy, deltas are the ones who provide the backbone of society, the support, the structure of the system, and the confidence in the institutions to allow them to perpetuate themselves. When those systems, those institutions become corrupted, however, deltas tend to be the least able to suss those corruptions and those problems out, to detect those things before they become so blindingly obvious to everyone. During the COVIDian nightmare of 2020 to 2022, deltas were the ones who were trusting the science. Social distancing, turning their lives upside down for 2 weeks that turned into 2 years to stop the spread. Deltas, more than any other archetype, conform to social expectations. And again, when society is healthy and functioning correctly, that's what you want. You want the majority of the population to be people who are entirely bought in, salt of the earth types. You can't have a majority of the population being gadflies or dissidents and expect your society to still function smoothly and peaceably. I am going to move away from the movie Gladiator for a delta example, but before I do that, I am going to stay with the movie Gladiator to point out a delta portrayed there. That is Maximus's servant Cicero, played by actor Tommy Flanagan. Cicero doesn't manifest much leadership on his own, but he's reliable and he's competent. When the plot to spring Maximus free of gladiatorial captivity is betrayed by Commodus's sister, Cicero ends up being used to bait Maximus. The relevant scene here is another one that is almost entirely visual, not one that lends itself at all to an exclusively audio recording. In the scene, Maximus is sneaking out to the outskirts of the city to obtain a horse Cicero is going to have provided for him to take. But Commodus has intercepted the plot and has set it up so that Cicero has a noose around his neck that Maximus can't see. It's at nighttime. Maximus subtly whistles to get Cicero's attention. Cicero realizes Maximus is there and immediately calls out that the plan has been betrayed and Maximus is walking into an ambush. As soon as he does, the noose goes up and he is being hanged, and Maximus runs to him to lift the bottom part of his body to raise his torso up so that he's not asphyxiating. As soon as he does that, Cicero gets filled with arrows because the Praetorian Guard has the whole place surrounded and the plot has been definitively foiled. Maximus's instinctive reaction to try to save Cicero at risk to himself shows the healthy dynamic that exists between functioning alphas and deltas. Sometimes it'll be crudely assumed alphas are inherently dismissive and condescending towards deltas or towards betas, but that reading ends up as a gross mischaracterization of what the SSH is. It's not just deltas who respect alphas. Alphas respect deltas too. And the tragic scene where Cicero dies in Maximus's arms is a pretty touching portrayal of that dynamic in action. The alpha-delta relationship isn't exploitative or contemptuous or anything like that. It's genuinely symbiotic. Maximus needs Cicero's loyal, reliable, unglamorous competence just as much as Cicero needs Maximus's direction and protection. The alpha provides the vision, the direction, the cause we're serving. The delta provides the faithful execution that makes the alpha's vision operational in the world. All alphas, and you have the bunch of chiefs, no Indians problem. All deltas, and you have a workers' co-op trying to run an entire company. The reason that scene where Cicero dies in Maximus's arms works so well because it's intuitively understood that Maximus's grief is real and it's proportionate. He's not mourning the loss of a mere instrument. He's mourning a man whose loyalty and faithful service were genuinely valuable to him and who he failed to protect. That's an alpha taking his obligations to those beneath him in the hierarchy seriously, deadly seriously. That's what separates legitimate alpha authority from mere dominance or tyranny or some positional authority devoid of the underlying character traits that define alphas in the SSH. Maximus's alpha nature is contrasted by Commodus, who occupies institutionally the alpha position, the ultimate alpha, apex alpha position as the Emperor of Rome, but without, totally devoid of any alpha nature to justify it. His relationship with those beneath him is purely extractive and fear-based. He can't inspire genuine loyalty at all from anyone, so he manufactures compliance through terror. In a real sense, the movie is a sustained contrast between legitimate alpha authority embodied in Maximus and the faux authority embodied in Commodus that he cannot manifest naturally at all, further underscoring the natural leadership qualities that characterize an alpha and distinguishing it from those occupying positions of high authority without the underlying alpha architecture. In the scene I'm about to play, the person responding to Maximus is Hagen, the beta that we identified previously.
I only need moments, so do not be careless with your lives. If you don't want any part of this, go back to your cells.
We wait here for you, Maximus. Strength and honor.
When he makes the offer, none of the men take him up on it. He doesn't, through positional authority, compel compliance, and yet he gets perfect compliance. That is the distillation of how the alpha operates, how it manifests. The pop culture reference I want to hone in on for Delta rather than bit character in Gladiator is the main protagonist in the movie Deliverance. the character Ed Gentry, played by John Voight. Gentry is quintessentially Delta in his baseline state. Suburbanite, functional, unremarkable, conventionally successful, but defined largely by his ordinary life. One of the things that makes Deliverance so compelling from an SSH lens is it's essentially a stress test of what different male types do when civilizational structure is stripped away. A group of 4 friends are going whitewater canoeing, remote area in Appalachia, and Lewis Medlock, played by Burt Reynolds, is clearly an alpha, the natural leader of the group, and the other 3 easily yield to his authority. But things go sideways when Medlock gets hurt, becomes debilitated, and one of the 4 dies, and it's left to Ed Gentry and Bobby Tripp, who's played by Ned Beatty. It falls to the 2 of them to cut through the wilderness and make it back to civilization, and it falls to Ed to effectively assume an alpha role because Bobby is close to an omega. Ed's forced by brutal circumstances, to try and access something deeper than his Delta baseline in order to survive. He manages it, but it costs him enormously. He returns to his Delta life permanently scarred from the experience. And this exchange at the beginning of the movie between Lewis, the Alpha, and Ed, the Delta, provides a great portrayal of the Delta baseline in both Lewis's description of Ed and Ed's self-description.
Machines are going to fail, and the system's going to fail. Then?
And then what?
Then survival. Who has the ability to survive? That's the game. Survive.
And you can't wait for it to happen, can you? You can't wait for it. Well, the system's done all right by me.
Oh, yeah. You got a nice job. Got a nice house. Nice wife. Nice kid.
You make that sound. Brother, hey, Lewis.
Why do you go on these trips with me, Ed?
I like my life, Lewis.
Yeah, but why do you go on these trips with me?
You know, sometimes I wonder about that.
Next, we'll take a look at gammas. Gammas are intelligent generally, but socially awkward and tend to harbor resentment, being especially susceptible to experiencing a lot of anger and inner turmoil, cortisol spikes over the actions and beliefs of other people. They are characterized by a mismatch in their own self-perception and what they believe society should provide them with, should reward them with, based on often their high intelligence, and what society actually provides them, or what they are actually able to take from society, earn from society. The position that they end up holding, especially socially, is one they feel beneath them and feel entitled to something better, to greater respect, to higher status. Vox Day coined the phrase secret king to describe a gamma behavior where they delude themselves into thinking that society that doesn't appreciate them is full of ignoramuses and that they have it all figured out, and if everyone else could figure it out too, then they would be able to be recognized as the kings that they really are, but that they aren't able to manifest in society. And in light of this, it will come as little surprise that gammas tend to be disproportionately among the ranks of comic book superhero storylines and universes. Society thinks of them as ordinary, maybe a little awkward, maybe a little weird, but really they are the pinnacles of humanity. And for a couple of pop culture examples of gammas, we are going to turn to The Simpsons. First, honing in on the resentment and obsession with the behaviors and actions and consequences other people experience. Our first gamma from the town of Springfield, and actually he was just a transplant into Springfield who was present in just a single episode, before meeting an untimely end, is Frank Grimes.
Welcome to the Simpson residence, or Casa de Simpson, as I call it.
Yeah, what did you want to see me about, Simpson? This better be important.
It is. But first, let me introduce you to my family. My perfect family. This is my wife, Marge.
Hello.
And our beautiful baby. My daughter, Lisa, IQ 156.
Hi.
See? And my son, Bart. He owns a factory downtown.
How do you do? Look, Homer, I'm late for my night job at the foundry, so if you don't mind telling me... Good heavens! This is a palace! How in the world can you afford to live in a house like this, Simpson?
I don't know. Don't ask me how the economy works.
Yeah, but look at the size of this place. I live in a single room above a bowling alley and below another bowling alley.
Wow.
I'm sorry, isn't that...
Yeah, that's me, all right. And the guy standing next to me is President Gerald Ford. And this is when I was on tour with the Smashing Pumpkins. Oh, and here's a picture of me in outer space.
You. Went into outer space. You.
Sure. You've never been? Would you like to see my Grammy Award?
No, I wouldn't. God, I've had to work hard every day of my life. And what do I have to show for it? This briefcase and this haircut. And what do you have to show for your lifetime of sloth and ignorance?
What?
Everything! A dream house, 2 cars, a beautiful wife, a son who owns a factory, fancy clothes, and lobsters for dinner. And do you deserve any of it? No!
What are you saying?
I'm saying you're what's wrong with America, Simpson. You coast through life, you do as little as possible, and you leech off decent, hard-working people like me. If you lived in any other country in the world, you'd have starved to death long ago.
He's got you there, Dad.
You're a fraud. A total fraud. It was nice meeting you.
And the other Springfield exhibit of Gammitude is a more established, long-running character in the series, Comic Book Guy. He's almost a writer's room deliberate construction of gamma pathology. He's got a superiority complex, massive contempt for others, passive-aggressive interactions are pretty much all he's able to engage in, and the profound gulf, the chasm between his self-image and his actual social standing, and how that leads him to retreat into arcane expertise about nerdy, obscure topics as a substitute for genuine human connection and real-world achievement. He's the ultimate gamma caricature, and The Simpsons is about providing caricatures of different types, and so in this way, Comic Book Guy is the perfect illustration. Even in the Mensa episode, where Comic Book Guy is around other high IQ eccentrics, he's shown in his element. He can't help but demean other Mensa members on account of having a slightly higher measured IQ than a high-powered lawyer. So he is, as a comic book store operator, asserting his dominance for no reason, unprovoked. For no good reason, anyway. The reason is the gamma psychology. But unprovoked, he puts this lawyerly woman down because he has a slightly higher IQ than she does. But probably the best distillation of Comic Book Guy's gamma nature with regards to his self-perception being mismatched with reality comes from Bart lambasting him for his most famous catchphrase, "Worst episode ever."
Last night's Itsy and Scratchy was, without a doubt, the worst episode ever. Rest assured that I was on the internet within minutes, registering my disgust throughout the world.
Hey, I know it wasn't great, but what right do you have to complain?
As a loyal viewer, I feel they owe me.
What? They've given you thousands of hours of entertainment for free. What could they possibly owe you? I mean, if anything, you owe them.
Worst episode ever.
And getting back real quick before we move on to the Mensa episode reference, something important about gamma psychology is the internal hierarchy never stops. Even when he's in a room full of people who share his defining characteristic, his high intelligence, comic book guy cannot simply belong. He has to try to establish dominance within that subgroup too. And the tragedy is Gamma's try to establish these status hierarchies that are often in their own mind that don't correspond to a reality. And yet, despite being so honed in and focused on them, they're not very good at getting to the top of those hierarchies. And so in the Mensa group, comic book guy immediately identifies a status axis, this raw IQ score, that he's on top of and uses it to demean someone else. Next, we'll discuss omegas. Omegas are at the bottom of the hierarchy. They are socially invisible if they're not actively rejected. And oftentimes the trajectory for them is they are actively rejected and then they retreat into social isolation such that they effectively become invisible to most of society. The simplest question to understand whether or not you are an omega is to ask, if you disappeared tomorrow, would anyone notice? Outside of your family of origin, your parents, maybe your siblings. Unlikely your children or your wife, because if you're an omega, you probably don't have those things. Definitionally, omegas are sparse in pop culture because it's difficult to make movies or shows that spend any time developing or focusing on omegas. Doesn't make for particularly compelling screenplays. Fortunately, Office Space, with its character Milton, played by Stephen Root, bails us out. Milton is socially invisible. He generates no social gravity at all. The film's joke is that the company literally forgets to fire him and keeps on through bookkeeping errors, accidentally paying him. To the question of would anyone notice if he vanishes, well, that test applies with brutal precision here. They move in the movie, the company he used to work for, he still gets paid for, even though he doesn't really work there anymore, moves his desk to the basement, and he doesn't even really register it. He eventually burns down the building over missing out on a piece of cake because he is so invisible in his social environment that the party planners in the office forgets to give him a piece of cake when somebody's birthday is being celebrated. And finally, we have the Sigma archetype. Sigmas exist largely outside of the hierarchy. They are, in some instances, able to achieve as much, if not more, than alphas are through independence and nonconformity rather than through social dominance. Something that omegas, although they often don't conform either, something that they're never able to achieve. They don't necessarily achieve that high status. They're not motivated generally by status considerations in the same way, or even naturally cognizant of status considerations in ways that other archetypes are. They're the men who march to the beat of their own drums. They're characterized by an internally generated set of values and ethics and objectives that they pursue that may or may not line up with broader social expectations. And so they tend to be the least socially conformist. Anonymously offer dissident commentary that characterize, say, the rise of the alt-right, for example, highly overrepresented by Sigmas. Parenthetically, something that's probably less true now, that there is a lot more status that can be achieved through socially unsanctioned internet commentary. The pop culture reference here is John Wick. He has a self-authored code operating outside institutional or social sanction. He doesn't pursue vengeance because society approves of that vigilante vengeance, but because his internal code demands it of him. He doesn't leave his previous life because society pressures him to do it. It's because he wants to build something he values on his own terms. And when that's violated, the vengeance response is inevitable and total. The person who walks away at the top of their game that's another Sigma tell. I think of Barry Sanders as the athlete who comes to mind as quintessentially Sigma and his archetypal. SSH identification. Before we bring the SSH to Final Fantasy, I'll offer a rough estimate of the population distribution of the SSH. We have alphas constituting 7.5% of the population, betas at 15%, deltas at 55%, sigmas at about 2.5%, gammas at about 15%, and omegas at about 5%. The alpha at 7.5% and beta at 15% is, while it might seem a little forced to be a perfect multiple of 2, is showing that alphas are less common than betas, and then betas at 15%, while deltas at 55%, and deltas are definitionally the most common, and so almost must, again by definition, constitute a majority, definitely a plurality, but probably a majority of the population. And one of the things to take from the ratio of alpha to beta being closer, significantly closer than the ratio of betas to deltas, is to show that betas are, although betas are in some ways in between alphas and deltas in terms of their social status, betas are closer to alphas. Critically, betas, as aforementioned, have the ability to lead, have the ability to step in for alphas and do an approximation of what an alpha role would require in a way that deltas are generally incapable of doing. Omegas at 5% correspond to the historical average of heterosexual men who go through their entire lives as virgins. We start with Final Fantasy IV and the main protagonist in the game, Cecil. This is a good place to start because Cecil is the cleanest, clearest example of a pure alpha character in any of the games we'll be assessing today, any of the games I've ever played, in all likelihood. The dynamic he has with Rosa, who is clearly a desirable, effeminate, nurturing and caring, and clearly portrayed as physically attractive. She is, in the crude PUA parlance, a 10, and she is entirely devoted and smitten with him. This despite the fact that while he does care about her, he is mission-driven. He has objectives and duties that he must fulfill, and his focus and competency in achieving those things is a big part of what attracts her to him. He's focused on the mission, and consequently, she's focused on him. In the almost immediate aftermath of accidentally killing Rydia's mother, Rydia placed her trust in Cecil. Tella joins up with him, the Mysidian elders, rather than trying to seek retribution against him when he comes alone to see them after being washed up from a shipwreck, after he honestly and forthrightly expresses his remorse and explains his actions. The elders aid Cecil in going to the Mount of Ordeals and transforming from the Dark Knight into the Paladin. That profound transformation is one that only deepens his authority. It's the gravitational center that the entire party, really in a lot of ways the entire game, orbits around. In many ways, the Alpha can be identified not so much by what he says, but how others respond to the things he says, or when he doesn't say anything, to the actions he takes. In the opening scenes of the game, when the Red Wings, commanded by Cecil, are attacking Mysidia to steal the crystal, Cecil himself has misgivings about what he is doing, and yet despite him as the leader, the one in charge, the one who has to be most on mission, despite him having apprehensions, questioning the justifiability of the mission he's been sent on, despite that, he effortlessly has those under his command follow his orders. And presumably they have a lot less to lose than he does for questioning these things, and yet none of them do, at least not in public. And of course, neither does he in public, but he does when he goes back and confides in Rosa. Quote, "Never again, even if ordered," unquote. Almost as cleanly as Cecil is alpha, so Kane is gamma. He's capable. Arguably, he's Cecil's physical better, or at least equal in the one time that they engage in combat. Although Cecil's heart is arguably not in it, Kane gets the upper hand. But Cain is consumed by his resentment and his envy of Cecil, and in particular, his infatuation for Rosa. He can't accept that Rosa chose Cecil, and that wound just festers. It eats at him. He believes he deserves what Cecil has. He is a testament of what goes wrong when you don't put bros before hoes. He is susceptible to Golbez's mind control in a way that Cecil is not, because he has that resentment existing as a foothold for Golbez to take hold of, for a way for Cain to one-up Cecil. I did qualify that characterization as being almost as clean rather than exactly as clean as the alpha characterization for Cecil, because Cain is presented as the leader of the Dragoons of Baron. Interestingly, he's never shown leading anyone. There are no other Dragoons that ever come on screen or have any part in the narrative that we see as players in the way that we see all of the members of the Red Wings under Cecil's direct authority, direct control. And so we can insinuate that if there is a contingent of people that Cain leads, these Dragoons that Cain leads, it's a smaller contingent and it's a less prestigious position than what Cecil holds as the captain of the Red Wings. Tella, I think, is best categorized as a delta. The rage he throws Edward's way could be read as resentment over his daughter Anna choosing Edward against Tella's wishes. And so in that way, illustrating the Gamma tendency to get entirely bent out of shape over the decisions of others. But there is for one thing, there's an obvious family dynamic. It is a father-daughter relationship. And so the rules that govern broader social behavior are not going to apply in the same way to a parental relationship with a child. But more importantly, I think it is that Tella genuinely misinterprets what's going on between Anna and Edward. He legitimately thinks that it is Edward's fault that Anna ends up dead, as though Edward somehow captured her or manipulated her against her will to come to Damascene Castle and then unnecessarily put her in harm's way when the Red Wings attacked. But he realizes subsequently that Anna's feelings for Edward are genuine and that it's not just a voluntary relationship, but a desired relationship that she has with Edward. As previously mentioned, Deltas get their guidance from systems and from institutions, and Tella is initially reading Edward's actions and Edward's kingdom as violating what those expectations are. And so that is where his ire is directed. But when he realizes that it is the kingdom of Baron that is at fault, and subsequently when he realizes the nature of the Baron kingship and how it's been usurped and how Golbez seems to be behind it, ultimately Zeramis is behind it, when he realizes these things, he shifts his anger and his desire for revenge correspondingly. His revenge obsession elevates his drama, but it is fundamentally a Delta's drama that is playing out. He's a competent, respected family man driven by, more than anything else, his love for Anna. He's not particularly dominant, but he's certainly not a broken man, nor one who is fundamentally delusional in the way that a Gamma would be, which is the other characterization he could be given. But the important distinction is in incorrectly identifying Edward as the cause of Anna's demise. He simply gets that one incorrect. It's an incorrect judgment, but it's not indicative of an underlying personality structure that consistently causes him to get things incorrect. Edward is a tough one. At first blush, he might seem an omega. Narratively, he starts as someone who runs away from his responsibilities, and literally in battle, he runs away from the fight to hide. He's defined by something like a grief paralysis, and he has to, over and over again, seemingly be dragged into functioning at all. Generally, deltas are unremarkable, but they are functional, and Edward is about as close to functionally useless as a playable character gets. But arguing against, and I think ultimately decisively against that, is that Anna, Tella's daughter, is portrayed as being genuinely in love with Edward. She isn't just attracted to him because he's a prince. She genuinely loves him. And Edward being able to garner the romantic love of a woman is something that almost by definition precludes him from being Omega. He is cowardly and conflict avoidant, but at a crucial moment, he rises from an illness to play his harp that ultimately allows Cecil and the party to fight against a dark elf. And so when things are on the line, he manages to step up to his Delta station. He works to rebuild Damascene Castle, though he does hide a lot. He does engage in some combat. He does fight to some extent. So I think my instinct is to characterize him as a sort of bashful, insecure Delta, but not quite Omega, on account of Anna's love for him and his ability to function under pressure when the party really needs him to. We have another clean characterization in Yang as a beta. Yang is quintessentially beta in the best sense. He's disciplined, he's dutiful, he's loyal, strong. He's a protector of his people and his family. He has a leadership position, not just with his family, but also among the fighting monks in the castle of Fable, but he yields to Cecil's leadership effortlessly. He doesn't jockey for dominance. He serves, he endures. And another thing that is characteristic of betas, well, it can be characteristic of really any of the archetypes other than gammas, which is the ability to self-sacrifice for the cause and to be able to do it without hesitation, without the hesitation that an alpha might exhibit on justifiable account of being more difficult to replace. To take a historical example, think of Alexander the Great famously fighting, leading from the front, fighting in the battles, being a renowned, martially prowessed warrior who never led an army into a battle he didn't want to be fighting right in the thick of. But when he died and there was a succession crisis, it was ultimately the downfall of the Macedonian Empire that he had spread out across so much of the Mediterranean and Asian and European world. And it was because for the Empire, he was irreplaceable. And so alphas will have more hesitancy, not out of cowardice for self-sacrifice, but for a genuine understanding that that could fatally compromise the viability of the mission. While deltas, in contrast, don't inherently, instinctively know exactly when self-sacrifice is called for. And even if they do, they are self-secure in their ability to pull it off. We talked about Hagen's self-sacrifice in Gladiator, and we have Yang's self-sacrifice in the Giant of Babel. Next, we have Edge as Sigma. There is a way to read Edge's character where he has Sigma affectations that aren't genuine. He comes off as trying almost too hard in his cockiness and his sort of lone wolf posturing and his seeming refusal to subordinate himself easily, although he does, despite some semantic protestations, come under Cecil's leadership immediately and without any interruption. And these are things that seem somewhat performative, which is definitionally not Sigma, because Sigmas don't need the performance. They don't need the affirmation from others. But I think it is more a genuine set of character traits that Edge possesses. He is naturally self-assured, cocky, a little bit conceited. It's not a put-on. It is his natural inclination. His passes at Rydia that are rebuffed is what clinches it in my mind. He doesn't get butthurt by them. He likes her, but he's outcome independent. He takes it in stride when she plays hard to get. He doesn't brood. He doesn't insult her when he's rebuffed. He doesn't try to take his frustrations out on anyone else. He takes it in stride and keeps on going. Palom, the boy in the Palom and Param twin set from Mysidia, is one where the ability to assess is limited on account of Pelham being a child, and the SSH is, as the name suggests, designed to apply to sexually mature adults. That being said, Pelham is a Sigma. He's brash and nonconformist, but in a way that's devoid of resentment. And though he is operating in the broader Massidian framework, after all, it is the Elder who dispatches him and his twin sister to keep an eye on Cecil. It's clear, most starkly so, when he self-sacrifices by turning himself and his sister into stone to stop the walls closing in from crushing the entire party, that he is operating on his own internal code. It's unlikely he was given explicit instructions to sacrifice himself to save Cecil. And even if he were given those instructions, that's a weighty ask for a prepubescent child. And so one who is able to pull that off is one who demonstrates a ferociously strong independent will. Fuso Ya is another beta. He's a guardian, a protector of an ancient duty. He's capable, but fundamentally exists in a supporting role to something larger than himself. He defers to Golbez when the two go to meet Zeramos. Sid is another tough one to characterize. He's clearly a competent craftsman. He's loyal, gruff, and functional. He doesn't have any pretensions to dominance, and so in this way he's classically a Delta, but he does, of his own accord, under his own independent judgment, self-sacrifice himself when he hops out of the airship. Something that doesn't end up killing him, but we suspect when it first happens that he is going to die from the airship as he sets it off in a blaze of glory to throw off the Red Wings' pursuit. When he ends up underground and is taken in by the dwarves, though, and he goes to make enhancements on the airship underground to allow it to fly over the magma, the dwarves fall in line under his leadership to help him assist with that. And so I think you could also make an argument that Sid is a beta rather than delta. If forced to pick one or the other, I'm choosing delta, but I can see the argument for beta as well. One that doesn't need much argument is Golbez, who, brother of Cecil, is as cleanly an alpha as Cecil is. He commands through his sheer presence and power. He literally bends others to his will, and also psychologically bends others to his will, figuratively bends others to his will. That he's being manipulated by Zemus potentially adds a wrinkle to the characterization, but that is in the realm of magic supernatural powers. I think it complicates things philosophically, but not behaviorally. In his actions and the actions of those around him, he clearly and without interruption illustrates alpha characteristics through and through. We'll move on from Final Fantasy IV to Final Fantasy VI and start with Locke. Locke is Gamma. He's an affable, charming Gamma. He's a genuinely good character. He's one of the protagonists. And that reveals an important aspect of the SSH that gets lost in its cruder, more popular vernacular understanding, where oftentimes Gamma is sort of a synonym for a weak, pathetic, impotent, self-indulgent man with an unjustifiably high opinion of himself. But Gammas can have a lack of congruence in terms of where they perceive themselves to be and where they actually are without being destructive and this is illustrated wonderfully with Locke's obsession in correcting people or thinking he's correcting people when they understandably observe him to be a thief, and he, in all caps, immediately responds with treasure hunter. He tries to correct them that he's a treasure hunter, not a thief. And that little trope, parenthetically, that occurs multiple times throughout the course of the Final Fantasy VI narrative about him protesting, no, he's not a thief, he's a treasure hunter. That is a humorous commentary on the nature of JRPGs, especially in that era where you, as the main character or the party that you're controlling as the player, go around and have no problem, no issue at all invading people's personal places, their private property, going into their houses, into their bedrooms, and taking whatever you find in there for yourself. Or into caves, or into mansions, or into museums, or into any of these places that the playable characters go to. They find this property that doesn't belong to them and take it and maintain while we're just going through, we're doing the dungeon crawling thing and finding the treasures that we happen upon. But from the perspective of people in broader society, in real world society in Mundania, operating in the real world outside of the high fantasy setting, or in the case of Final Fantasy VI, the steampunk setting. Outside of that, the idea that you go around and simply help yourself to whatever you find, no matter where you find it, well, that sounds like the behavior of a thief rather than a treasure hunter, whatever exactly that means to someone beyond the age of 6. Another tendency of Gamma's we didn't articulate previously that has to do more with the sexual part of the socio-sexual hierarchy is the tendency towards one-itis, and Locke exhibits a serial form of one-itis, one-itis being the all-consuming devotion to one woman. That is in contrast to the alpha's abundance mentality that there are as many women as there are fish in the sea, and I am confident in who I am and what I do, and so if the woman isn't interested in me, that's her loss. And that all goes on sort of subconsciously with an alpha, while the gamma will obsess about that one he must win over, or he will never have an opportunity for anything like that again. It's Rachel before we meet Locke, then it's Terra for a bit until we meet Celis, and then it's Celis. And once it's moved to Celis, after apologizing to her for not trusting her when Kefka claims she's a spy for the Empire, when Celis doesn't immediately accept his apology, but instead gives him the cold shoulder, later when Celis reconsiders and tries to talk to Locke about it, Locke returns the behavior by giving Celis the cold shoulder. And that is much different than the alpha abundance mentality. He is feigning indifference to Celis at that point. He doesn't have an indifference towards her. He's still gripped by that one-itis for her. But there's a resentment there in her having rebuffed him that he feels necessary for his own ego protection to then subsequently rebuff her. And one more thing before we leave Locke that I forgot to mention explicitly, in his denials that he's a thief and his insistence that he's a treasure hunter is betrayed by the fact that one of the in-game commands that his character has in battle, is steal. We move next to Edgar, King of Figaro, Alpha. He's a natural leader. He commands his kingdom effortlessly. He's socially dominant in every room he enters. And that's congruent with his position as monarch, but it's not contingent upon it, which we see in the world of Ruin. I'll get to that shortly when we contrast an alpha, beta, and delta in the game among three of the protagonists. And as to the objection of his try-hard playboy appearance that he puts on, that's clearly a front. The king could take advantage of his subjects. Clearly he could. And given the reality of power dynamics and female hypergamy, he wouldn't even have to. Very often, if ever, if that's what he was after. But it is an affectation that has real utility. Namely, in providing plausible deniability when the Empire, led by Kefka, comes calling, looking for Terra, and based on the reputation that Edgar has been able to create about himself being this playboy wannabe womanizer, he is able to play off not being familiar, not being aware of a 17 or 18-year-old co-ed in his presence. Because there are so many of them, he can't keep them all straight. And on the other side of the coin, before he understands fully Terra's story, he is working with the Returners against the Empire, and he is able to use that same cover story to potentially get more information out of Terra than he otherwise would have been able to, by putting on the pretense that he's just interested in a little hanky-panky maybe, and so don't get too uptight about withholding secrets about your identity and stuff, like your power level. That's not really what I'm interested in. That your abilities would be a distant third. Next is Sabin at Beta. He's disciplined, he's loyal, he shows a willingness and a competency to take charge of a situation, but he is not drawn inexorably to a position of power when it was available to him. He walked away from the throne voluntarily to pursue martial training and the understanding that that is what he would be able to best utilize his skill set for. He could have been a functional king had that role fallen to him, but Edgar is the better fit for that role, and Sabin inherently understood that. Next we have Cyan, who is Delta. It may seem, given that he's the retainer to the kingdom of Doma, that Beta or even Alpha would fit better. There's no questioning Cyan is a thoroughly good man, but one thing that distinguishes Betas from Deltas is that when their Alpha leader gets put out of commission, the Beta is able to continue without the Alpha's direct guidance. Cyan struggles mightily on this account. When Doma gets poisoned, he goes on an ill-advised, to understate the case, an ill-advised suicide mission in an attempt to apparently try and fight the entire Imperial encampment on his own. That's not Alpha or a Beta. That is a Delta in crisis, without the tools or the skill set to respond appropriately. But I think the best Alpha, Beta, Delta contrast in the game comes in the World of Ruin. Celis finds Sabin holding up a burning house in Zin, holding it up, single-handedly keeping it from collapsing so that the people inside can escape. He's spending his time. We're made to understand that about a year has transpired since the World of Ruin came into place and Kefka rose up on the floating island and obliterated much of the world. That over that year, Sabin is now spending his time on mission, trying to help people muddle through the nihilistic destruction Kefka has wrought on the world. Sabin is leading resistance to Kefka here, but he's not doing it in an especially effective way. That is, he is stepping in to give an approximation of an Alpha. He understands what the mission is, and he's still contributing to it in a meaningful way, but definitely not an optimal way, not an especially effective one. He's literally putting out the fires that Kefka starts. He's a Beta stepping up to an Alpha role because, far as he knows, there is no Alpha present. Edgar, simultaneously we learn, is also taking action, but he's doing so in a much more effective way than Sabin is able to pull off. When Celis finds Edgar, he's in the middle of finding a way back to his castle so he can free his castle up from underground to ultimately gain access to an airship so that he can take the fight to Kefka directly. And underscoring again Sabin's Beta nature, when he sees what Edgar's doing, he effortlessly and instantly shifts to that objective. Cyan, we find in contrast, is writing love letters to a woman while pretending to be her deceased husband. He is doing nothing to fight back against Kefka. And while he's a good man trying to do something good by sending these apocryphal love letters to a woman who is thinking her husband is still alive, he is actually just drawing out her suffering by providing her with a false hope. Without a system, without an institution to lead him, and without an Alpha to provide that direction for him, he is floundering. Sabin is enhanced by Edgar's leadership and immediately takes Edgar's lead when the two are reunited. Cyan is redeemed entirely by the group meeting up with him and showing him the way, but without them, he's completely lost. Next up is Setzer. Initially, thinking through Setzer, I wanted to identify him as Gamma, but I think that is clearly incorrect. At first blush, it's hard to argue that trying to kidnap Maria is a Gamma move. It's definitely not Alpha. An Alpha wouldn't have to resort to illegal behavior to get the girl. The girl would be drawn to him naturally. But it's in his reaction to being outplayed with the devil-headed coin that is the textbook illustration of Sigma outcome independence. As a little refresher, because it's pretty deep in the weeds of the game, Setzer is trying to capture an opera singer named Maria, but Maria gets swapped out for Celis, who is a former Imperial general who's part of the protagonist's party, and so Setzer accidentally, or errantly from his perspective, captures Celis instead of Maria, but he is taken by Celis, finds her at least as attractive as he thought he would find Maria. And Celis, in cahoots with Edgar, provides Setzer with a challenge. If he wins the challenge, he gets the girl, he gets Celis, but if he loses, they get to use his airship. And the challenge, such as it is a coin flip, and they use Edgar's two-headed coin, and so the fix is in. Setzer is engaging in a contest he can't possibly win. Now, of course, he doesn't realize that until after it's played out, but upon being bested, he respects that. He melds it into his own Sigma understanding of how the world works, says the famous line, quote, "My life's a chip in your pile, ante up," unquote, and then honors his end of the bargain and provides the airship for the party to use. There is some open question in his relationship with Daryl. His female love interest, it's Daryl spelled Daryl, and is clearly a woman in the game. It's left as an open question as to whether or not their relationship was primarily built on the fact that they had shared interests and personality types, or because of something deeper. Casting Setzer as Sigma insinuates that it's more of the former. Not that entirely functional and meaningful relationships can't develop over shared interests and compatible personality types, but if he is overcome with a one-itis for Daryl, that does complicate the assessment a little bit. Next, we have a clean beta call with Strago. He is a leader in his small Tamasa township. He serves as a guardian figure and has devotion clearly to Realm, his granddaughter. He's capable and respected in his domain, but he doesn't seek to dominate anything or anyone. When the party first comes into contact with him, he overrides the larger Tamasa population in the townships, forbidding the use of magic, but because Realm is in trouble, he and the Delta town people yield to his authority and join him in trying to cast magic spells to put the fire out in the house that Realm is stuck in. But he isn't able to pull that off. He has the right idea, but he can't effectively stop the fire. He has to bring in bigger guns in the form of the party that the player is controlling. So these are things that further underscore his beta nature. Mog is another beta. He is a leader among the Mughals, which could some level suggest an alpha, but the Mughals are a small and pretty secluded community, and when the party runs into Mog happily and without any hesitancy joins the party and does so without any pretensions to leadership. Amaro, then, it follows naturally, must be Delta. He's a force of nature physically, but socially he simply follows whatever Mog tells him to do. He's capable, but he's not really self-directing in any meaningful hierarchical sense. Could also make the argument that Mog is Delta and Amaro is Omega. but it's hard to square Amero's physical prowess and his willingness to come along and be a capable and devoted member of the team if he is an Omega just wanting to hang out in his underground lair cave full of the bones of the different animals that or people that he has eaten. And so I think Beta is the better fit for Mog. His natural leadership of the Mughals and of Amero suggests at least Beta. His easy deference to the group suggests he's not naturally alpha, but in the absence of any alphas, betas are usually able to fill the role well enough, and Mog does that, leading the Mughals and leading Amero. And with Amero, we're dealing with a really limited level of character development or expression, but I think Delta fits better than Omega for Omero. Yikes, even though saying that, I realized that the alliteration, Omero, the Omega, does flow better, does sound more natural than Umero, the Delta. But here we are. Gogo is another tough one. Apropos the earlier comment about the difficulty of portraying Omegas in any story on account of them not being particularly compelling figures, makes me want to handicap a bit in favor of, or reach a bit in favor of characterizing those who might fall under the Omega description as Omega. In the case of Gogo, the Sigma call, there is a Sigma call that's defensible in that whatever structure it is that Gogo is living by, it's totally outside of any broader cultural or social structure, and that's characteristically Sigma. And in the case of Gogo, it is really outside of the rest of the world. It's an area, a realm, wherever it is that he's existing. It's inside of, or in a different dimension. I forget the specifics. To access Gogo, the player has to be swallowed up by this vortex worm hybrid thing that then takes the player to a weird underground layer, or perhaps something in a different dimension, where Gogo is hanging out, seemingly not doing anything at all inside of the stomach of this worm, or perhaps in a different dimension. It's not formally fleshed out exactly what this place is, what he's doing in it, how he's sustained there. And so all these questions raised about his or her existence, Gogo's existence, argue in favor of someone definitionally existing outside of the broader social hierarchy. And so in that regard, there is an argument for him to be Sigma. On the other hand, the test of if you vanish tomorrow, will anyone notice you're gone, as being fundamentally and almost inherently identifying an Omega, well, by that metric, Gogo is clearly Omega, and on account of wanting to err on the side of Omega when a case can be made for one because of how rare they are in stories, in narratives that are told, we're going to categorize Gogo as an Omega. Now we get to Kefka. Kefka is a Gamma taken to its ultimate apocalyptic extreme. He's characterized by resentment, a perpetual sense of being overlooked and disrespected, despite his high position, his high status in the Empire. He's one of the 3 generals directly underneath the head of the entire thing. He's number 2, number 3, number 4 to Emperor Gestalt, arguably tied with Leo and Celis, definitely among the inner circle, among the top brass. If he's not, to put it in American political terms, maybe he's not the president, but he's the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense or the Vice President or something like that. And even moving one step up from that isn't enough. When he achieves godlike power, he still essentially acts out gamma pathology on a cosmic scale. This isn't alpha dominance, that cruelty that he displays. It's gamma bitterness with unlimited power behind it. General Leo is beta. He's exceptionally capable and competent, but despite that, he's not at the pinnacle of the imperial structure, and that is on account of his beta nature rather than being an apex alpha like the next one we'll get to, which is Gestalt. As we mentioned with Cecil and other characters, it's not necessarily what the alpha say as much as it is how those around the alpha relate to the alpha. And in the case of Gestalt, he rose to the top of the imperial structure, which strongly suggests an alpha nature. As far as him slipping and eventually being tricked, being bested by Kefka, I think that's attributable not to his lack of alpha qualities, but for one thing, he's quite old and he's slipping, as older leaders tend to, as we in the Western world in general and in America in particular have been faced with firsthand in the early 2020s. But the thing that knocks him off his perch is a genuinely unforeseen external challenge, not just to his position, but his life, in the form of Espers attacking him, attacking the Empire, and that rattles him. But he rather remarkably manages to regain his composure. He begins deceptively working to double-cross the Returners and the Espers simultaneously to reassert Imperial power, and he almost pulls this off. He slips up in misjudging Kefka, but even Kefka only kills Gestalt after Gestalt first tries to constrain or harm or maybe even murder Kefka and Tomasa. It's not made explicitly clear what he is trying to do, but it's Gestalt who draws first blood, or tries to draw first blood against Kefka. We'll move to Final Fantasy IX now, where we'll start with Zidane, who is a strong Sigma. He operates outside any normal social structures, almost by his very nature. He's a thief. He leads through charisma primarily rather than any sense of hierarchy. He moves pretty effortlessly between interacting with Garnet, who is royalty, and the thieves in the bar in Lindblom, where he's loosely from, to the extent that he's from anywhere. Like Edge pursuing Rydia, Zidane pursues Garnet without neediness. He maintains his core identity even after the devastating revelation about his origins and that he's not that much different from Vivi. And yet, with a little help from his friends, he's able to recover from that revelation and continue on living out the mantra that is his in the opening vignette of the game, where it is shown a quote relating to Zidane that says, "You don't need a reason to help people." Next we move to Steiner, who is a Delta, almost a parody of a Delta. His entire identity is rule following and institutional loyalty to the point of dysfunction. But as we talked about when we laid out the Delta tendency towards conformity, we qualified that with the observation that that is a healthy thing to have in a society, as long as the society is running well, is functioning correctly. And in Steiner's defense, up until relatively recently, when we're introduced to the story, Alexandria seemed like a functional kingdom with good leadership. It's only after Garnet's dad dies and his mother becomes possessed or controlled by Kuja and Garland that things start going sideways. And that becomes an important part of Steiner's story arc. He is essentially a Delta who learns to exercise some level of independent judgment without abandoning his Delta core. He is contrasted to some degree by Beatrix, who, yes, as mentioned, the SSH doesn't apply to women, but effectively Beatrix functions as a male character. She's a leader of the military forces in Alexandria. She seems to be like a senior. Her contingent is senior to Steiner's Knights of Pluto, or whatever they're called. That seem to be kind of the JV squad, whereas she is leading the varsity squad, but she effectively functions like a male character, despite the very G-rated romantic interest dynamic that takes place between Steiner and Beatrix. But Beatrix is a beta, and she is able to more quickly ascertain the nefarious nature of what Queen Braun, the Queen of Alexandria, has become. We have Baku, the leader of Tantalus, as a natural alpha. He leads, he sets the agenda. His gruff exterior masks genuine strategic intelligence. He does a lot of clever things throughout the story. Nobody ever questions his leadership, even when Zidane wants to leave Tantalus. He respects the weird requirement Baku makes that they fight before he goes. And so even a Sigma like Zidane feels a force and a pull towards Baku's leadership. That's the characteristic of an alpha. Vivi, perhaps the most beloved character in all of the Final Fantasy series among the general fan base, is a Delta. His existential crisis about his nature and mortality places a heavy burden, a heavy weight, an unusual depth for a Delta character, but his social positioning is fundamentally unassuming, quiet. He's very follower-oriented. He is ultimately trying to figure out what the system is that should be giving him direction for his life. He's trying to figure out what to conform to. And it just so happens that his journey of trying to figure that out is extraordinarily difficult for a Delta to have to do. Generally, it's a lot easier for Deltas to figure out what it is that they need to conform to. Amarant, who has an ability called Chakra, is a Gamma, clearly. And I don't think we're supposed to read that as commentary on subcontinentals being Gamma, having a Gamma orientation towards their fairer skin competitors in the form of Zidane, but it just so happens that Amarant's relationship with Zidane is what so clearly identifies him as a Gamma. He's capable, but he's also deeply resentful. He defines himself almost entirely through his opposition and his contempt for others, or his total befuddlement over how they've been able to achieve what it is that they've been able to achieve. He can't process being bested by Zidane without it becoming a all-consuming preoccupation of his. And he is consumed by losing this contest with Zidane because in Amarant's world, his self-worth is defined by that martial prowess. And yet Zidane, in contrast, as thoroughly a Sigma, doesn't even seem to give it a second thought. He wins the contest, and yet it means nothing to him, whereas Amarant loses, and it means everything to him. Next, we go to Quina, and even if you take issue with the characterization of Gogo as being Omega, it's hard to argue against Quina being Omega. Quina exists entirely outside of social dynamics, but not because he or she engages with them in a meaningful way while not being influenced by them. Quina is oblivious to them, and broader society is oblivious to him. He's defined almost entirely comically by his appetite rather than any relational positioning. He generates no social gravity at all in any direction. The "would anyone notice if you vanish" test is one that applies to Quina more trenchantly than just about any other character in the series. And that brings us to Kuja, the most contentious character from an SSH perspective in Final Fantasy IX. Arguing in favor of Kuja as Gamma is that he is consumed by his status relative to Zidane. He seems incapable of accepting that Garland chose Zidane over him as the superior genome, and his entire catastrophic endgame, destroying the crystal, damning everything, looks at first blush like a Gamma's "if I can't have it, nobody can" response, taken to its ultimate extreme expression. But arguing conclusively against the assessment of Kuja as Gamma is what is effectively Kuja's last act. He uses what remaining power he has to send the rest of the party to safety as the Ifa tree is in the process of collapsing and crushing everyone. Zidane attempts to save Kuja, but Kuja declines the help. Gammas have a lot of faults, but giving up isn't one of them. Of all the types in the SSH taxonomy, Gammas are the least likely to willingly sacrifice themselves for someone else or for a cause greater than themselves because they conceive themselves as the greatest cause, or they conceive themselves as being chronically underappreciated by the system, and so their motivation to save it is often non-existent. Sigmas, in contrast, have their own code. That often means they have their own understanding of the world, one they often view as more accurate or superior to that of broader society. It's one of the reasons they aren't moved much by societal status hierarchies. Kuja was convinced he understood the world in a way that no one else did, and that his understanding was correct. And for a while, it looked like he might be right. But then it all comes crashing down on him, and after exhausting every avenue to redeem his position, he realizes ultimately that his reading was fundamentally incorrect. He'd lost the game, and he lost the game badly, and the only thing left to do was go out on his own terms. It's the only bit of control he still had in terms of his understanding of the world, or his incorrect understanding of the world. He could have gone out in a gamma rage after trying to exhaust every potential escape avenue that he had, every attempt to save his own skin that was provided to him, before ultimately going out in a suicidal, fiery rage if he had no other options. But instead, he concedes defeat, and he uses the last of his powers to save his erstwhile adversaries. And there is just no fitting that final act into the Gamma framework. We can contrast Kuja's final moments with Kefka's. When everything collapses around Kefka, when his grip on power weakens, when the triad is defeated and his angelic form is beaten, he doesn't save anyone. He accelerates the destruction of the floating continent to try to kill everyone on it. Kuja, in contrast, does something categorically different. He processes his total defeat, he integrates it, and then he acts against his own interests in a way that serves other people who were his former adversaries. His epistemological approach was off. Kuja believed he understood the nature of genomes, what Garland's plan was, how he could leverage that power. He wasn't performing those beliefs for status. He actually held those beliefs, and when the evidence conclusively falsified his model, he updated accordingly, and he faced the consequences of his own defeat with dignity, with almost some level of magnanimity, rather than exploding in rage. Sigmas have codes that exist independent of social validation. Kuja's final act was consistent with his code, even though it cost him everything. That is something that would never characterize a Gamma. Before we get to Final Fantasy X, which is where we'll round off the classifications of select Final Fantasy games, we're going to detour into Chrono Trigger, which, if you look into the development history, is effectively a Final Fantasy game. It was initially intended to be a Final Fantasy game. There was a lot of crossover in the development team, and it's not unusual for those who express a lot of fondness for the Final Fantasy games of that era to include Chrono Trigger among the list of their favorite games, right up there with, if not surpassing, the Final Fantasy titles. Chrono is an alpha, clearly. He says nothing, but as we've alluded to a few times, often the lack of words presents less of a problem than we might think at first blush in assessing where a character falls in the SSH structure because of how those around that character respond to him. And Chrono's clearly a natural leader. He's brave, but he's not reckless. He commands loyalty effortlessly, and he does so with almost no dialogue, which in its own way is a strong alpha marker. You can think of Russell Crowe's character Maximus in Gladiator as a prime example of that. He doesn't need to explain or justify himself. Others simply follow. Others like Frog, Robo, even Magus eventually. His willingness to sacrifice himself at Lavos is decisive alpha behavior. And as we talked about previously, there could be concern with alphas compromising the mission by taking their own unique, often irreplaceable perspective out of the mix. But in front of Lavos, Chrono was the only one who could free himself enough to get up. He was the only one who could make the sacrifice. And given the circumstances where it was him making the sacrifice or the end of the world, he unflinchingly sacrificed himself. We move next to Frog, or Glenn. He's Delta. He falls into a funk midway through the narrative with the memorable lament, quote, "The hero I am not, I can do not," unquote. With Cyrus lost to him and his inability to protect the queen, he throws in the towel. He doesn't, in his perception of it, his conception of it, he no longer has that guiding light, that institution or positional power, authority to provide him guidance, and so he gives up. And he does so well before all hope is lost. We know that because once Chrono takes him under his wing, and then the good guys end up winning with Frog's assistance, but not with Frog's leadership. Frog gels as easily with Chrono as he does with Cyrus. Cyrus is another alpha. But Frog, despite being a major character with a lot of dialogue and a lot of actions, never slots into a leadership role in any capacity. He's honorable, he's courageous, he's a stellar Delta, but he is a Delta. Robo is another Delta. He's defined by his role, not any desire for social dominance. He provides an extraordinary illustration of Delta salt of the earth functionality at its most extreme case in spending 400 years turning the desert into a forest. He does it tirelessly, largely thanklessly. Certainly in those 4 centuries, it's thankless, even if ultimately when traveling from 600 AD to 1000 AD, we're able to thank him upon, in the snap of our fingers, finding him after toiling in the heats first, the dry heat of the desert, and then the humid heat of the forest afterwards. 4 centuries of toiling, but in service to a cause he believed in a system that he understood. And now those things are quintessentially Delta. We move next to Magus. He is clearly Sigma. He operates entirely outside of all the social structures and the time periods in the game. He doesn't follow anyone's code other than his own. He's feared and respected, but he doesn't really lead or follow in any conventional sense. The mystics get behind him, but there's no indication that he's especially interested or driven to lead them beyond pursuing his seemingly inscrutable objective at first, an objective that becomes clear as the story unfolds, and his desire to travel through time to confront Lavos is so far out of the general social structure that the vast majority of the denizens in the Chrono Trigger universe wouldn't even understand what he was trying to do, what was motivating him, if he explained it to them. And when he does join the party, he does so on his own terms. We move next to Dalton, who is a Gamma. He's ambitious but resentful of those above him. He's cruel to those below him. He in a comically over-the-top fashion lays out the reasons that he has the resentments that he does. He sees under Zeal's hierarchy. Even the names of his attacks indicate his Gamma status. The Dalton Force, the Golem Summons. These are Gamma performances masking a real sense of inadequacy, insecurity in his martial prowess. And he gets beaten consistently by people he considers beneath him, something that only deepens his wounded Gamma psyche. Kino, husband of Ayla, is a Gamma. His jealousy of Chrono and Ayla's taking to Chrono and Chrono being more physically capable than Kino leads to Kino stealing the gate key out of resentment from the party, and that's textbook Gamma petty sabotage. The only redemption for Kino potentially is that he is quite young and acting in a way that might not be indicative of his fully developed personality traits. We'll finish up now with Final Fantasy X and Titus. Titus's dynamic with his father Jecht makes this call a little more difficult than it would be without Jecht's presence. Without Jecht's presence, Titus is clearly alpha, and I still think that's where we land. There are points of distinction. When there are multiple alphas jockeying for position, there will be an apex alpha, a greater alpha, and lesser alphas. And so in the dynamic between Jecht and Titus, Titus is less of an alpha than Jecht is, or perhaps more accurately, Titus is an immature alpha. Quite literally, in a biological sense, he is 17 in the story's narrative, so he is still a teenager, whereas his father is a full-grown adult man. But it's really in the dynamic with the Aurochs, the Besaid blitzball team, that Titus is clearly identifiable as an alpha. And we'll just go ahead and jump ahead here to Waka, who is a beta. And those two assessments fit remarkably cleanly into the story of the Aurochs. When Titus shows up, Waka is the leader of the Aurochs. He is a beta, approximating an alpha and doing a serviceable enough job in the sense that the team is coherent and they're organized and they can play together and they have some minimal level of competency, but he's not especially good at fulfilling the alpha role. And so while the Aurochs have a team in the tournament that we participate in as the player, that Waka and Titus play in, it's mentioned that the Aurochs lose every year in the first round. So they are a team led by Waka, but they're the worst team around. And then when Titus joins the fray, well, they have the potential, depending on how it plays out with you as the player, of being the best blitzball team around. Waka has some capacity for leadership, but easily and comfortably yields to Titus when Titus shows up. We move next to Kamari, who is Delta through and through, defined entirely by his protective function toward Yuna. His role is bodyguard, and that is what he does with steadfast, capable devotion, but in a way that's fundamentally reactive rather than proactive or generative. He's got a backstory with some of the other Ronso, where he's socially beaten and he loses his horn, he's exiled, something that would fill, say, a Gamma with incalculable rage and resentment, but Kamari just redirects it into his service serving Yuna. But he's definitely not Omega, because if he were to disappear, well, certainly Yuna would notice it, and Yuna is one of the most important central characters in the story and in all of Spira. And so if the Queen will notice your absence, well, your status is more than nothing. Orin, like Magus, provides another over-the-top illustration of a Sigma existing outside of the normal social structures, the broader social structures that the universe exists in. In the case of Magus, he's time-traveling all over the place. In the case of Orin, he's dead, literally dead. He answers to no one, and he follows his own self-imposed code that transcends institutional loyalty or the laws even of biology. He doesn't lead the party, but he walks alongside it, and he is regularly referenced by the party for guidance and for wisdom. He has a quiet authority that comes from who he is and the experiences he's had rather than any formal position that he holds. He also has the added bonus of looking Sigma. If you were going to provide an avatar for the modal Sigma character, it is Orin, aesthetically. Jekt, as previously mentioned, is alpha, raw alpha. He's dominant. He sets the terms of every relationship he's in, whether it be with Orin and Yuna's father, Braska, whether it be with his interactions with Titus or anyone else that he interacts with. And his flaws are very typical alpha flaws, namely his dominance that is devoid of any sensitivity. So he's unable to develop and maintain any sort of meaningful, deep relationship with his son. It's superficial, it's trivial, it's adversarial, and that is because as a pure alpha, he, from his perspective, doesn't have the time to get involved with the petty emotions that his son feels like he needs to work through, and these are things that a natural alpha simply senses his way through naturally. We finish up Final Fantasy X with Seymour. Seymour is Gamma. He's consumed by his status relative to others. He is a halfling, and that leads to him feeling rejected. His entire nihilistic philosophy of kill everyone to end suffering is essentially a Gamma's resentment of all of the cosmos dressed in some philosophical or theological clothing. He's snuffing everyone out for their own good. I guess there's a sort of Buddhist logic of enlightenment and ultimate self-erasure as the way to nirvana, but from a Western understanding, it just sounds like thin theological or philosophical veneer for what are actually misanthropic, nihilistic, destructive impulses. And he has a one-itis for Yuna that rivals that of any character in the series otherwise, to the point where even after he's dead, after he enters a zombie status, he still is insistent on marrying Yuna. On the other hand, it's not for the typical Gamma reasons. It is because he is trying to use her, if I recall the story correctly, and I probably don't, but he's trying to use her as a tool to become Sin himself by having her summon Sin, and then he'll become Sin in place of Jekt, and then he'll destroy Sin and everything else all at once so that all of suffering will end, or something to that effect. And so there we have it, or we almost have it for the major antagonists and protagonists in Final Fantasy games. I have the requisite knowledge to offer assessments on, but I forgot one now thinking through it from Final Fantasy IV, so we're going to reclinate back to catch Rubicant, the leader of the Four Fiends, as a beta, and on a surface level that's easy enough to grok. He serves under Golbez, who's the alpha, but he is the leader of the Four Fiends. And so those three fiends, to the extent that these fiends that don't really have much in the way of moral architecture at all can be considered to fit into the SSH, these fiends are pretty delta as far as fiends go. The other three, Rubicant is clearly the leader of the Four Fiends, but still subordinate to Golbez. And so in that reading, cleanly enough, he is beta. But we can go a little bit deeper with that analysis. The sort of lieutenant role that Rubicant occupies here in the hierarchy of Golbez and his crystal collecting forces is crucial in understanding the underlying beta psychological architecture. They are capable enough to command respect from those below them, but oriented towards service of those above them, such that they don't jockey for position or be at risk of supplanting those who they are subordinate to. Rubicant isn't jockeying for Golbez's position, but he's also not resentful that he has to manage the other fiends. He just does his job with integrity, does it well. And the other three fiends as Delta underscores the reality of SSH hierarchies in the real world. The bulk of any organization or any society's functional layer is going to be Delta. There's an interesting broken parallel here, too, with Golbez as Alpha and Rubicant as Beta, contrasted with Cecil as Alpha and Cain as what would be the intended Beta role, but the Cain as Gamma, interestingly, is less able to as capably fulfill this corresponding role for Cecil as Rubicant does for Golbez. Rubicant actually fulfills his Beta function with integrity, while Cain's Gamma psychology corrupts what should have been a similar position. And even though they're ostensibly on different sides, Rubicant, after being defeated by Cecil, attempts to learn from Cecil to apply the leadership style that he saw and he recognized as superior to his own by Cecil, and that is the joining of forces together. So Rubicant takes that information and tries to put it into practice by gathering the other three fiends to challenge the party together as a group. And while Rubicant and the fiends' effort is more formidable when they're together, but it's still not enough to overcome Cecil, because Rubicant's a Beta and Cecil's the Alpha, and Rubicant's the antagonist and Cecil's the protagonist. Cain, in contrast, rather than learning from Cecil like Rubicant does, resents Cecil having a thing that he wants, or a lot of different things that he wants, not just the woman, but also the things that Cain could potentially learn from Cecil, he instead seems to just resent Cecil for. Whereas Rubicon recognizes Cecil's alpha gravity, extracts a lesson from it, and becomes a better beta as a consequence, Cain encounters that same sort of alpha gravity, and his response is corrosive. Rather than learning from Cecil or taking satisfaction of being the right hand of a natural leader, a position that in many ways, as Vox Day himself has said, betas in many ways are the most desirable archetype to be. Not, again, that the SSH is a prescriptive framework. It is a predominantly descriptive one. But the point still stands that being Cecil's right-hand man is a pretty honorable position to have, and yet Cain isn't able to accept that, but instead resents it. Talking through that reminds me of a couple other loose ends I need to wrap up before we exit here. I went through using Gladiator, the alpha in Maximus, the beta in Hagen, the delta in Cicero, and though I didn't articulate it explicitly, I think it's clear, the gamma in Commodus. But I think there also is a sigma in the movie, and that is Proximo, the owner, the one who purchases, the owner of the traveling gladiatorial operation. When he feels like he's been cheated, he grabs another merchant that he's transacting with by the balls in a way that indicates he is not policed externally by social norms. He ostensibly chases wealth, but what he really wants is freedom that the wealth provides him. And he assumes when he first encounters Maximus that Maximus must want some particular thing himself, after Maximus's initial successes in the far-flung provinces are followed by Maximus scolding the crowd for their dishonorable lust for bread and circuses. In the end, Proximo is willing to turn against the prevailing power structure, not for money, but instead to honor his own personal code, with freedom sitting at the top of that hierarchy. He tries to play it off that it's on account of Maximus having persuasive friends that Proximo decides to join the conspiracy against the empire, against the emperor, against Commodus, as if he's doing it for money, but Commodus is the one who made him filthy rich in the latest round of gladiatorial games, and it's unlikely that conspiring senators working underground are going to be wealthier than the head of the empire itself. What motivates him is the realization that Marcus Aurelius, that's the man who gave him his freedom that he so desired, and that Sigmas often desire, was betrayed by Commodus. And so he, that is, Proximo, feels compelled to honor the late Aurelius, not out of a broader social sense of honor, but in accordance to his own particular way of honoring the man who honored him as a Sigma yearning to be free. And so that persuasive friends line is a face-saving device. It's a way of trying to frame his decision in transactional terms. But Commodus betraying and murdering Aurelius isn't just a political event to Proximo. It's a personal violation of something he actually valued. Sigmas are often viewed as being aloof from the social structure, but it's not as though they have no loyalty or attachment or any code that they operate under. It's just that they're without conventional conceptions of those things. Proximo's loyalty to Aurelius's memory is entirely consistent with Sigma psychology because it's self-determined. It's not mandated by the broader social structure. And he ends up choosing to honor that relationship on his own terms in such a way that he ultimately pays for that decision with his life. And yet as he goes, he is still adhering to the code that he had developed way back in his past. Dust and ashes, he says, as the Praetorian guards break in and stab him to death. And the very, very last character I want to offer an assessment on comes from Final Fantasy VI, and that is Ultros, the mischievous purple octopus. He, like Locke and Kefka, is another Gamma, but whereas Locke exists on one end of the spectrum of being affable, charming, and Kefka on the other as being terror-inducing, nihilistic, apocalyptic potential of the worst instincts of Gammas gone entirely off the chain, Ultros settles somewhere in between those two, and the existence of all three of those iterations of the Gamma archetype in the same game helps underscore the observation that to maximize the utility of the SSH, Gamma should not be thought of as just a synonym for someone who is weak and resentful. Gammas can be those things, but they can be more than those things, and they don't have to be all of those things. Anyway, we're first introduced to Ultros as a monster seeking lunch in the Serpent Trench, but after the party beats him, he tries surreptitiously to injure Terra, even though he's been bested by the party and it's clear he's not going to be eating anyone. He, out of spite, tries to injure her. And Sabine, executing that now familiar tendency of betas to risk self-sacrifice when the situation calls for it, chases after Ultros. But Ultros will return again and again to pester the party for no apparent reason other than to try, in a roundabout way, to force their respect on him as a competent foil, and also maybe finally eat them, which is what he ostensibly came after them for in the first place. Physically, he's cowardly. That's a trait that's not exclusive to Gammas, but it's overrepresented among Gammas for sure, as they are the archetype least amenable to self-sacrifice. And I've said it a bunch of times, I'll say it again, though the SSH is primarily descriptive rather than prescriptive, Vox Day does note the potential for Gammas in particular to move towards becoming Deltas if they're motivated and committed to doing so. And it's interesting in this vein that we find Ultros in the world of Ruin working an honest job at the Colosseum as a receptionist. And although of the other times we've come into contact with him, he's attacked us, at this meeting with him, he makes no attempt to pester the party any longer. He has made that transformation, at least it seems, given outward appearances, that he's made that transformation from Gamma to Delta. Before making that transition, though, we see that behavioral pattern in him being bested again and again and coming back again and again as a very Gamma tell. A Delta or a Beta in the same situation would accept the outcome and move on, but Ultros cannot process being defeated without needing to reassert himself. Gammas, characterized by thinking that the world owes them more than it has given them, that their self-perception is the accurate one and the world's lower perception of them is the inaccurate one. Well, that mental framework cannot process being defeated because the challenger was better than him, and just leaving it at that. Perhaps it's the destruction of the world of balance and the descent into the world of ruin that causes Ultros to reassess his situation and his understanding of the world. But we also have a moment that precedes that where Realm paints Ultras's portrait, and Ultras's reaction is one where he is stunned by being confronted with the contrast so starkly in how he perceived himself and how he was actually perceived by the rest of the world. He comments that I'm just a stupid, ugly octopus, or something to that effect. It's almost too perfect an exclamation point on gamma psychology, illustrated in a funny narrative form. And that Realm is the one who does it, makes it even more perfect. Realm's a child. She has an uncanny ability to capture exactly what she sees without any social filtering or diplomatic softening or anything like that. There's not malice in her portrait. She's simply painting what's there. And that makes it more devastating to Ultros than any other intentional critique could be. Ultros isn't being attacked. He's being seen. He's being portrayed accurately. Possibly for the first time. That's the way he reacts to it, like it is the first time. And that alone is sufficient to momentarily shatter him. And that honest perception that Realm offers Ultros is something that only the candor of a child permits. If he had been given a similarly accurate assessment of himself by some fully mature adult, well, the Gamma is quite well suited and prepared to dismiss that, to counterattack the perceptions offered by the mature adult and accuse making the observations being motivated by jealousy or bad faith. There are all kinds of different ways to reframe that observation as something with some nefarious ulterior motive when it comes from a mature adult. But when it comes from the honest candor of a child, those defenses are all rendered useless, and Ultros is forced to confront nakedly the reality of what he is. And he is able to, for a moment, escape his own elevated, inflated self-perception. And so it is in that moment, potentially, that the seed is planted that eventually allows him to make the transition from Gamma to Delta. And that really will do it. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next time.